So the next presenter we have is Scott Griffith. So Scott leads the newly established Emerging Technologies Unit here at Civil Aviation in New Zealand. Scott's aviation career began in the Royal New Zealand Air Force before transferring to the Royal Air Force in the UK, following the disestablishment of New Zealand's air combat function. He went on to complete 20 years as a military fast jet pilot, tactics instructor and standards examiner on aircraft such as Tornado F3, Hawk T1, Hawk 128. He operated throughout the world before returning to New Zealand in recent years. Scott has held roles in the CAA in the New Southern Skies program, licensing and standards, and more recently the Emerging Technologies program, ETP. The aim of the ETP is to act as a bridge between CAA and the emerging technologies, aviation and aerospace stakeholders to provide the more effective ongoing regulatory interface as possible in order to enable the safe and effective integration of emerging technologies into the civil aviation system. Scott's team is responsible for the public face of the ETP and to provide a coordinating function for pre-decision making activity that necessarily must precede regulatory approvals required for novel and disruptive technologies. So if we can welcome Scott.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. That introduction and bio kind of gave the headline of what we're here, what the Emerging Technologies program is about, and I'll just flesh that out a bit. And I suppose for this audience, the focus, I'll try and make it a bit about where we fit into the system, but also where we don't fit into the system. Wrong way. Cool. You'll be all aware of this. This is a standard elevator pitch that I give to everybody, but I've left this in here because we frequently have to give this explanation to people who are coming in from the system that aren't from an aviation background, and they don't quite get how the sort of flow of the international and then domestic setup works. And we often get kind of comments going around, oh, can't you just change the rules to make such and such happen? It's like, yeah, we don't make the rules. It doesn't quite work like that. Colin already read this out, but again, it's a fairly standard brief that we give to everybody, and I thought it was still worthwhile to leave it in here. To see those key bits that I've left highlighted. So we do have this bridging function, and my team we straddle this bridge where we go between innovation on one side and regulation on the other. And the idea is to have an effective regulatory interface for the safe and effective introduction of these technologies. I'll explain why that's been done very shortly. So this is a little graph that I came up with to kind of explain the sort of changing nature of what's coming into aviation. So if you take those items on the left-hand side, which broadly actually quite similar to that VUCA framework that Keith talked about earlier, and then you take time along the bottom, what you have is that aviation has always experienced a natural increase in those things over time. But that time frame we're talking about is generally on the sort of level of decades. But civil aviation systems are actually set up to deal with those sorts of evolutions. But lately we're seeing that happening. So particularly the uncertainty is rapidly increasing with very quick turnarounds and iterations coming from innovation. So that, there's a disconnect there between how the system's set up to deal with evolving technology versus emerging technology, which is developing far more rapidly. But then even more challenging than that is we get stuff that just crops up out of nowhere. It doesn't have any pedigree prior, and there's no kind of history that we can look back to leverage as to where it came from and how it might fit in the aviation context. Many of the innovators that we see do not come from an aviation background. They come from like a Silicon Valley background, that type of thing. So the technology they're bringing to the party probably hasn't been involved in aviation previously. Okay, so what is an emerging technology? Well, it's a lot of things. So it could be aircraft, it could be subsystems, it could be use case. Generally, it's stuff that hasn't been approved or certified before. It's novel, it's not routine, and it's definitely not limited to UA. And again, this is something that even within the team and the program, we have to often lift our gaze and say, look, it's not all about drones. There's plenty of stuff going on in the more traditional sectors that is disruptive and novel. So within the CAA, a bit of a dry slide, and you don't really need to see the details too much, but it just sort of explains where my team fit in versus what the program is. So my team, a small team, and we're the smallest bubble right down in the bottom there, and we have the sort of coordinating function as well as a few other bits and pieces. But we don't do any of the, we don't do the decision-making work, that's for sure. That sits in the next bubble. You know, the particular team in there is the certification of aircraft and product, most of whom are here today, most of whom you'll be interested in. But there are at least 6 other regulatory units that do the decision-making work. They have to come together to make these things happen. Outside of that, we've got some supporting elements. It's the usual stuff like engagement and comms and legal, etc. Also, we've had a regulatory intelligence function come into that supporting role recently, which has been extremely valuable because that's getting insights from around the sector and we're enabled to do research that we simply didn't have the capacity to do ourselves. And all of that is bound together by a governance group, a steering group, which Keith chairs, and which meets every quarter, just to set the direction and make sure that we are focusing on the right things. And out of all of that, we're trying to achieve this outcome of the safe, secure, and effective introduction of these technologies. In due course, because it hasn't been figured out what it's going to look like yet, is that as these technologies become more routine, they will then sort of feed more into the business as usual. So a monitoring function will have to come about, but that's a future state, which is why the dotted lines exist there. This is another view, maybe a more simplistic way of looking at what we had there, and to sort of explain this coordinating function that we have and how we bring all the pieces of the puzzle together. So my team's that little circle right down the bottom, and then you've got all these other elements that we have to try and bring together in various amounts and at various times to get some sort of approval moving forward. And I've lay-personized these labels here because, again, I often have to explain this to people who don't come from an aviation background, and they probably wouldn't understand the technical names for these areas. But obviously, the bit that you're probably most familiar with would be the certification airworthiness part of it. Okay, so what we do, the ways of working. The introduction said we're newly established. We're actually getting close to our year-long anniversary, so I should probably change that bio now because we're not that new. But out of roughly those last 12 months, we've got come up with 3 broad functions that we do. So the first one is that we will collaborate with an innovator if we get a referral and we come across them and we think that they're at a point where they're sort of between a very early technology readiness level where they're just basically fleshing out some ideas, but they're certainly not at the end of the scale where they're ready to go and submit an application. If they're somewhere in the middle, then we'll get in and we'll do what's called pre-decision making with them. And I'll explain a little bit more about that on the next slide. The second thing we do is, if it's a really complex application, then we'll sort of kick in and do a project management role. We've only got one of those, and that's with Air New Zealand, and their ambitions to field a zero emissions technology demonstrator in the next few years, and I've got more detail about that later. Suffice to say, that's taking up a huge amount of our effort. Basically, a third of our workload is spent on that one project. And when I say we project manage it from a CAA point of view, try and pull all the pieces of the puzzle together internally. We don't project manage what the applicant's doing, that's for them to manage. And then if necessary, and again, maybe I need to update this because it's almost always necessary, is that out of doing these 2 things, we figure out that there's a process missing, or there's a gap somewhere that we need to fill internally so that lessons can be learned and then it can be repeated in future. Now, the thing is that me and my team, we don't have any legal decision-making powers, and we can't interfere with the decision-making. So once we've done all this kind of coordination pre-decision-making work, we hand it off, and then we step back. And that looks a little bit like this. So if you divide this slide into two, if you look at the bottom half, existing decision-making process, that's what's always existed in the system, and you'll recognise those 6 regulatory units there. Previously, what was found is that innovators would come in and they'd try and engage with this decision-making process and basically hit a brick wall. They didn't know what to do, no one was willing to collaborate with them, and then things just came to a grinding halt. So what we did is, on top of that, we tacked this pre-decision-making phase. And it's a collaborative process with us. So what we do is we get the participant, if they're sufficiently kind of at a stage where we think this is actually going to happen, then we'll assign them a project advisor, one of the staff of my team, and they'll come up with some combined output learnings and recommendations, trying to figure out what the regulatory pathway might look for them and what pieces of those regulatory puzzles need to be drawn together. And once we've completed that, then we'll hand it over the ethics wall to the decision makers, and that's where we step back. But what this slide, and it's because it's only subtle, is the dotted line. That's actually a really key function for what we do, is that we can sort of walk this bridge, we can walk this line and understand what the innovator wants to do, and then throw some ideas around with the decision makers and say, hey, look, would this hold water? Are we on the right track here? No, that's a rabbit hole. Maybe think about this. Okay, go back. And this kind of iterative process can happen because we have this function of being able to do the collaboration. We can have the open and honest conversations without being accused of regulatory capture, because we simply cannot be captured because we don't make any decisions. So that dotted line is actually a really key part of our work. Methodology, so it's sort of a flow of how we would try and build someone up to a point where they can submit an application. You've got technical readiness on the bottom, regulatory readiness along the side, and basically we try and get these things to move along in concert with each other. And you don't really need to read too much about the words in there, but basically we're trying to move, as they move along their own technology readiness levels, we're trying to also increase their regulatory readiness level, so in harmony, when they get to the end of that road, then we've got a well-developed application which can go in and go through with relative ease. Okay, this does change a little bit, depending on whether we're looking at someone brand new versus an operator who's already been in the system. So for a new applicant, there's always going to be a waiting time. There's backlogs in the certification area, there's backlogs in the 102 area, and these are various amounts of time, but we might as well use that time. So with a new applicant, we get stuck right in and we do that pre-decision making stuff about what is your initial application and entry to the system going to look like. For an existing participant, we don't get involved with what's being assessed right now. That would just be an extra layer of bureaucracy, and we don't want to gum up the works. But what we do is we look over the horizon. So, okay, maybe they're at phase 1 right now and that's being assessed. Okay, what's phase 2? What's phase 3? What do we need to get the regulatory system prepared for to deal with your next development? So we basically just do this iterative process. We can't do this all on our own. There's only 6 of us, but there's at least 600 SMEs worldwide, probably more, that are working in various organisations around the place that are also struggling with all this disruption coming in. So we beg, borrow and steal from around the place, and take what we can. If it works with our context, then we'll use it, and we're also happy to share with what we do elsewhere overseas. Okay, so for the team, so just going to introduce who we are. So as an Emerging Technologies unit, I like to think of us as a program team. as opposed to a unit in itself, because we do span all these other functional areas of the UK. And we based it on what we do on the UK CAA Innovation Hub and elements of the New Southern Sky program that I used to be in. So Steve Smith, he's the director, and he's away this week, and the reason that is because he was actually in Montreal last week at the ICAO RPAS panel, and this is part of the strategic stuff that he takes care of. So the ICAO RPAS panel meets every 6 months, and basically we need to send some delegates to that to sort of fight the New Zealand and the South Pacific corner of what we would like the various SARPs and annexes to look like moving forward as ICAO needs to shape its own documentation and best practice to how to deal with these things. A case in point that we've been fighting for quite hard along with Australia recently is how to deal with UA that need to operate beyond 12 nautical miles of a territorial limit, because under the Chicago Convention, that's basically a no-go unless you've got a full type certificate. When we realise that that's really limiting, especially with the geography that we have in New Zealand, especially when you want to test random new things, the safest place to do it is well off the coast. We don't have the luxury of some other nations that have great big deserts where they can test stuff inland, so we really want to get a solution to that, and so working papers have been proposed, led quite heavily by us, to try and get a solution to that one. I'm the deputy director, which means I'm the operational and team lead, so I set the workload for and the things that my team should be working on. And this is the team. So we've got 3 project advisors, and Alex, who's the kind of glue that holds it all together, as a technical and events coordinator. Areas of expertise for the team. Alan, he's a very experienced 5,000 hour plus rotary pilot, and he's worked on the other side of the fence being a senior persons in various guises out in industry, and he's nominally our airspace expert. Dan comes from he's actually a military background like me, but on the engineering side of the house. He's also worked in innovation at WorkSafe. He's worked on the Hyundai Rotem contract that runs the Wellington train network, and he's nominally our certification advisor. And then Sophie Ray, she's a non-aviation person, comes from a legal background, but has a particular specialisation in how to shoehorn AI into existing legislation, and she's also fast becoming our international law expert. So we've got quite a few bases covered there, even within this small team. Okay, so that's kind of roughly who we are and what we do. I'm just going to go on a few examples about the weird stuff that we deal with. So reducing zero emissions project. So Dan is leading this one, and he's pretty much working full time on this. And it's been so big that we've actually had to bring in a temp for him to do a lot of the admin support in terms of all the project management, nuts and bolts that have to happen. So, and that's come about because Air New Zealand want to field a commercial demonstrator by 2026, which is a very aggressive timeline. The photo you see, or the artist rendering you see on the side there, is one of the shortlisted types that they're going for. But you'll find probably some major announcements coming out from Air New Zealand in the next couple of months about what they're going to use and where they're going to fly it. So yeah, there was 3 clean sheet designs and 1 retrofit that they were looking at. And this involves multiple parts of the CAA to try and bring all the pieces of the puzzle together to get this happening. So we have to really flex the rules and policy on alternate fuel and power plant. It's going to affect licensing, type acceptance, infrastructure routes, etc. And the type acceptance piece of this is going to probably cause quite a lot of workload for Colin's team when it comes, and it's coming fairly soon. The second thing is AAM, UAM, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of noise about that internationally, millions and millions of dollars being invested. And we're doing a little bit in New Zealand to try and test out dip the toe in the water of what self-flying air taxis might look like from an operational perspective. The challenges here is that the UA are clearly not VFR, and they're kind of difficult to approve IFR, certainly if you're using a proxy system like is being done here. And Airways, bless them, they have no separation standards to deal with anything in controlled airspace that's not IFR or not VFR. So you end up with a disconnect here. What do we do? because their only solution is to segregate. So what we're doing is doing some flight trials, which will kick off very shortly, the phase 2. It's going to be either later this month or next month, I believe. And this proxy UA, which is operated by In Situ Pacific, which is also a Boeing company like Wisk, is going to be flying around south of Christchurch on some routes which have been designed by Aeropath. And that's been leveraged by basically being able to assess the operation in the system as being IFR equivalent. And in no small thanks to Renz, who did a lot of the work here in the year, in fact last year, to come up with a lot of the technical investigation to bring that IFR equivalency to fruition. And the IFR equivalency is just bounded for this trial. We might be able to leverage that same ethos moving forward, but at the moment it's just for that trial. And we've managed to bring Airways along with this journey. So they, that IFR equivalency was issued in December last year, and they've been working on their safety case ever since. So it takes that long to kind of figure these things out. It's ended up being way more complicated than anyone ever thought. But like I say, hopefully later this month or next month, we'll actually see the flights taking place. And this aircraft will be flying around separated and just mixed in and integrated with all the traffic that happens around Christchurch. And then finally, some of the left field. And by the way, the two things I've just mentioned are really, there's a clear sustainability piece with them. The UAM aircraft are all electrically powered. In New Zealand are looking to decarbonise. Electric aircraft have their limitations. Here's a potential solution to that limitation. So there's a company called Aquila, startup in New Zealand, and they're looking at remote charging of aircraft with infrared lasers. And when we first heard about this, we thought this was absolutely nuts. But it turns out, they've done a lot of lab testing, and it's lab-proven technology. And it potentially could be a way of reducing some of those limitations of electric aircraft, if you could charge them while they were flying. So obviously baby steps. They're going to start with charging UA, and then in due course they might move on to charging passenger aircraft, initially from ground stations, but their ultimate goal with this is to create a constellation of energy. So think of a Starlink for electricity. So, you take a renewable energy source which is out in the middle of nowhere, maybe a massive solar farm in the middle of Sahara, I don't know where it would be, but you beam that up to space and then it gets sent out to wherever the energy needs to go, including maybe down to aircraft. Who knows? It's pretty crazy and it's pretty interesting idea. So that gives you just 3 examples of the tricky stuff that we deal with, and we've got many more other things, and we get approached almost weekly by someone with a weird and wacky idea. Okay, I think that's it for me. So we do have a page on the website, but this is your opportunity to ask questions. Before I do that, though, before I open the floor to questions, I can address a couple of things that came up earlier in Keith's talk, just from my perspective. So the New Zealand versus the international attractiveness of RPAS. That's an interesting one. So 102 rule is it's a double-edged sword. It's really good for doing something strange and interesting and new and testing out, a crazy idea. It's not necessarily optimized for doing something that's relatively straightforward and you want to repeat it at scale and set up like a standardized pathway to do something. And I think a good example there would be agricultural UA. These are commercial off-the-shelf drones that you can buy from DJI, and just having maybe a couple of standardized pathways, one for an owner-operator, farmer who wants to use it on their own land, that could be one, and then one for a contractor, like a Part 137 type of operation. It would be quite useful if there was a standardized way of doing that, but 102 being entirely performance-based is very tricky to make standardization. So that's where you get your kind of your pros and your cons with 102. And then Space Agency versus CAA and general government alignment. Yep. Look, it's no secret that the Space Agency and the Outer Space and High Altitude Activities Act was set up in rapid succession to enable Rocket Lab to work. And that has worked. Rocket Lab is functioning perfectly happily. But now I think everyone's turning their minds to, okay, how can this be used more broadly? Because the Act doesn't really speak to doing anything other than a very credible company coming from with an FAA Part 450 approval. So, minds are being turned to that to figure out how to open that up. A particular challenge for the CAA, I suppose, and the difference with working with the Space Agency is CAA has an independence as a regulator. The director has independent decision-making authority, whereas the decision-maker from the Space Agency is their minister. So that's quite different. And there's obviously going to be the odd bit of tension and odd bit of friction going on there. But we are working with Space Agency to develop as close a relationship as we can. Okay?